13 Mustang horse leads female veteran to an abandoned border outpost. What's inside is unbelievable. No one knew where the Mustang came from. No one called it, yet there it stood. At the edge of the prairie and the falling sun, its eyes fixed on something clearer than words. A female veteran, newly returned from the harsh white sands of war, never expected that the first thing to guide her home would be a wild horse. But when it turned toward the canyon and paused, glancing back, she understood. Something was waiting below, a message, a secret. When she followed, through stone, pine, and memory, what she found inside that long-abandoned border outpost would change her life forever. Before we begin, let us know where you're watching from. And if you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to subscribe. The moment Riley Morrigan stepped off the small plane at the modest airstrip outside of Montana, she felt an unsettling mixture of relief and apprehension. Her duffel bag, an old military issue, rested against her hip. Over a decade working as a combat medic in the Middle East had etched subtle lines into her face, and the weary determination in her eyes spoke volumes. Dust motes danced in the afternoon sun while she stood, momentarily unsure of her next move, until she spotted an aging pickup truck. A friend of her late mother's had left it there for her, with one handwritten note on the dash: "Morrigan Ranch still belongs to you." As she drove toward Iron Pass, Riley glanced at the seemingly endless plains stretching to the horizon. The truck rattled and groaned over bumps in the road, a faint squeaking of old parts echoing through the otherwise silent interior. She was still adjusting to the quiet. In the desert war zones, there had always been engine hums, distant shelling, or the tense hush of anticipation. Here, the hush felt stark, unbounded. A single sign announced the outskirts of Iron Pass, faded paint on splintered wood. The town looked almost unchanged since she last saw it. Back when she was just a teenager visiting for holidays, Iron Pass itself was small. A handful of shops, a post office, and a cafe with peeling paint that used to serve the best cinnamon rolls in the county. As Riley rolled through the main street, people paused to observe. They recognized the broad-shouldered woman with short, practical hair, the one who had left so many years ago for the military. Some nodded curtly, others simply watched. It was a gaze that held neither open welcome nor outright suspicion, more a guarded curiosity. Riley gave a faint, polite wave but didn't stop. She had one destination in mind, and it lay beyond the old wooden arch, proclaiming Morrigan Ranch. Upon reaching the arch, she halted the truck. The wooden beams were cracked, iron nails rusted, and parts of the sign had peeled away. The gate itself leaned precariously to one side. It felt as though she were about to cross into another world, a place her mother had cared for but had also in some way abandoned. Riley's heart squeezed uncomfortably at the memory of missing her mother's final moment. The guilt of arriving too late for the funeral still weighed on her. Taking a slow breath, she continued down the gravel path until she saw the ranch house. Time had not been kind to Morrigan Ranch. The once sturdy fence surrounding the main yard was warped and broken. Patches of tall grass had reclaimed sections of the property, and an old iron gate dangled by a single rusted hinge. In the distance, 3 horses stood in a rickety enclosure, their ribs visible beneath dull coat. They lifted their heads as Riley stepped out of the truck, their eyes reflecting a mixture of caution and faint recognition. She murmured a soft greeting, unsure whether she was comforting the animals or herself. Pushing open the front door of the ranch house, Riley was met with stale air and the faint odor of disuse. The wooden floor creaked in protest under her boot. Dust swirled in the light filtering through frayed curtains, and a single rocking chair with a white cloth draped over it sat in the living room. On the mantel above a soot-stained fireplace rested a framed picture of Marie Morrigan, Riley's mother, and a much younger Riley. Standing side by side for a moment, she imagined her mother's voice calling out as if from the kitchen. But there was only silence. In that silence, memories flooded back. Her mother had been distant yet somehow larger than life. Stoic, fiercely skilled at breeding and training horses, and never one to give lavish praise. They had only shared occasional phone calls while Riley served overseas. Updates clipped and formal. "I'm fine," her mother would say, or "ranch work is the same." Now all that remained was dust and echoes. setting her duffel on the scarred hardwood floor. Riley tried to picture what might have been conversations they never had, visits she never made, a goodbye that came too late. She spent that first evening huddled on a threadbare sofa in the living room, listening to the wind groan through old window frames. Sleep eluded her as she stared at the dark ceiling. Occasionally, the haunting ring of distant memories returned. The beep of a field hospital monitor, the muffled thud of mortar shells, the frantic cries for a medic. She told herself this was supposed to be a fresh start, a place far from those nightmares. Yet the quiet only amplified the noise in her head. Eventually, she dozed off, trapped between guilt and exhaustion. Come morning, Riley forced herself up at dawn and set about the chores in a methodical manner, almost as if she were back on a military schedule. She tidied the room that had once been her mother's, dusting off shelves, discarding old newspapers, and discovering scattered horse-breeding catalogs piled in corners. Here and there, she found a few rosettes from horse shows, half-eaten by time. Every piece of her mother's life told a story Riley had never bothered to read. She felt a pinch of regret, remembering how she used to roll her eyes at horse talk. Outside, the 3 horses awaited feed and water. She lugged bales of hay from a storage shed, offering them fresh water from a rusted trough. One of the older horses, its coat once black, now peppered with gray, nudged her gently with its muzzle. As if seeking reassurance, Riley stroked its neck. "I'm here now," she murmured, though whether she was speaking to the animal or her mother's memory, she could not say. Something flickered in her chest, an unfamiliar stir, subtle but undeniable. Perhaps she was, in some unspoken way, reclaiming the threads of a life she'd abandoned. The work was both physically draining and oddly therapeutic, replacing broken fence boards, hammering nails, pulling out rotted posts. Each action grounded her. She was used to crisis, to bandaging wounds under pressure, to making life or death decisions in a war zone. Here, though, the urgency was different. Time moved slowly, and each finished task felt like an accomplishment rather than mere survival. The ranch, though battered, had a quiet resilience. So did she. Perhaps late in the day, the sun dipped behind the hills, casting the yard in soft, golden light. Riley stood at the broken gate, surveying the land. The breeze carried the faint smell of pine from distant hills and the metallic tang of old fencing. Her muscles ached, yet a new kind of resolve hummed beneath her fatigue. There was no dramatic revelation, only a small sense that this place deserved another chance. Just as she did. She might not fully understand her mother yet, nor the ranch's significance. But for now, returning here felt like a necessary step toward healing something lost. In the days that followed, life at Morrigan Ranch settled into a lonely but steady rhythm. At sunrise, Riley woke to the chill of Montana morning. She fed the horses before brewing herself a cup of bitter coffee in the old kitchen. By midday, she'd do small repairs, tackling them one section at a time, mending a loose gate latch or cleaning out the musty storage shed. Evening arrived with the same hut. She'd sit at the worn dining table, sipping lukewarm tea in place of dinner, gazing out the window at an empty yard. No phone calls, no visitors, and oddly she found she preferred it that way, at least for now. But when darkness fell, her mind betrayed her with the echoes of war. Sleep became an elusive companion. Night after night she bolted upright in bed, heart pounding, the taste of desert sand and the acrid smell of burning metal clinging to her senses. She remembered the overhead lights of the field hospital, the frantic voices calling her name, Corman, and the pressure of bandages on wounded limbs. Once, she awoke gripping the edge of her blanket as if it were a soldier's arm, desperately trying to keep them from bleeding out. Trembling, she would scribble brief notes into a small journal. "There are no bombs here, but I still hear them." One afternoon, while attempting to patch a few holes in the barn roof, Riley stumbled upon a locked wooden chest in an older part of the structure, a makeshift loft that her mother had likely used for storage. The padlock was rusty and fell away under the pressure of a crowbar. Inside lay a treasure trove of documents, breeding records, neatly folded show ribbons, and official certificates from the state's Livestock Association. Tucked underneath was a photograph that made Riley's breath catch. In that photograph, a much younger Riley, maybe 7 years old, sat astride a diminutive bay-colored colt. At her side stood Marie Morgan, one hand lightly on the reins, the other placed protectively on Riley's knee. What startled Riley most was her mother's expression, a gentle, open smile that she had rarely seen in real life. She couldn't recall the exact day the photo was taken. Perhaps it was at a local fair or a training session. Either way, the image painted a different portrait of Marie than the one Riley had carried for so long. Returning inside, Riley set the chest on the kitchen table and rummaged deeper. She found more photographs, some in black and white, others Polaroid snapshots. A few articles detailed her mother's success at showing horses at county events, praising Marie Morgan's methodical breeding program. One newspaper clipping boasted, "Local rancher raises champion mare." Riley had never known how far her mother's reputation extended. That discovery left her with a pang of guilt. She had never asked. She'd always been too caught up in her own world. First as a rebellious teenager, then as a soldier on the front line. Night descended, and Riley placed one particular photo, Marie smiling beside that bay colt on her bedside table. She couldn't shake the feeling that she'd only seen fragments of the woman who raised her. Why had her mother never shared these accomplishments, these proud moments? Maybe she tried, and I wasn't listening, Riley thought. She pulled out an old album from the chest, flipping through the pages by the faint glow of a single bedside lamp. Images of a younger Marie, confident at livestock auctions and standing tall at award ceremonies, captured a side of her mother that felt like meeting a stranger. At some point that night, exhaustion finally claimed her. Strangely enough, Riley slept through without the jolt of nightmare. No rushing adrenaline, no phantom sirens. She dreamed instead of a wide Montana sky, of a mother and daughter crossing a quiet pasture together, the hush broken only by the soft nickers of horses. When dawn approached, she awoke with a curious sense of calm. The guilt and regret that had plagued her for months hadn't vanished, but they felt a touch more bearable, like a wound that finally recognized it could heal. Late afternoon found Riley Morgan walking the southern fence line of her ranch, where the grass sloped down toward the jagged boundary of Raven's Hollow. Fewer people bothered with this part of the property. Most of the wooden posts were broken, and stretches of wire sagged pitifully among the knee-high weeds. The air carried a mixture of resinous pine and stone dust. Somewhere in the distance, wind whistled through the canyon, conjuring a restless melody that hinted at the wild terrain beyond. She paused by a post that lay flat on the ground, trying to gauge how much material she would need to fix it. That was when she noticed a flicker of motion amid the low shrubs near the edge of the slope. Squinting, Riley made out the outline of a horse, a Mustang, by the look of its sturdy build. Its coat was a swirling hue of ash gray and brown, as though the earth and sky had blended across its hide. Mud clung to its flanks, and its mane hung in tangled locks. Yet something about its stance radiated alertness rather than fatigue. Cautiously, Riley edged closer. The horse stood motionless in the grass, regarding her with dark, unflinching eyes. She realized it was favoring its left hind leg, lifting it slightly off the ground. An injury or perhaps just a lingering soreness. In the silent standoff, the wind brushed dried leaves across her boot. She expected the animal to bolt. Wild horses rarely tolerated humans this near, but it remained there, ears forward, nostrils flaring for a moment. They merely stared at each other, a taut hush hanging between them. Riley had the uncanny sense that the horse wasn't just gazing at her, but into her, taking her measure in the same way she took in a wounded soldier. She lifted one hand slowly, palm out, a calming signal she'd used countless times around skittish creatures. The Mustang made no move to flee. Instead, its barreled chest rose and fell with a single deliberate breath. No fear, only a quiet, measured curiosity. Riley muttered under her breath. "You're no ordinary wild horse, are you? You're more like a question." The words felt absurd, but she couldn't shake the notion that the animal had appeared for a reason. Suddenly, the horse swung its head and pivoted toward the slope, moving in a slow, deliberate gait, as if it expected her to follow. Riley's heart gave a mild jolt. Instinct flared. She sensed it wanted her to come along, and inexplicably she wanted to. There was an allure in the creature's calm authority, an invitation she found impossible to resist. "Heaven," she whispered, not entirely sure where the name came from. Perhaps it was the sense of an unspoken refuge that emanated from the Mustang. Or maybe it was a whim, a fleeting notion that this horse represented some strange solace. "If you're showing me something, Then I'll go. Before trailing it down the slope, Riley returned to where her saddle horse, Reba, stood tethered to a leaning fence post. She patted Reba's neck, looped the reins securely around a sturdy tree, and gathered a few essentials from her saddlebag: a flashlight, a small folding knife, a canteen of water. The last thing she needed was to stumble into the canyon unprepared, yet at no point did she think to turn back. She couldn't explain why, but she trusted this Mustang, heaven, to guide her somewhere meaningful. With quiet resolve, Riley stepped toward the edge of Raven's Hollow. The setting sun stretched her shadow across the rocky ground. Haven moved ahead, each step measured, leading her along a narrow trail that hugged the crumbling edge of the ridge. The descending light tinted everything in a fading gold, and the wind gained a cooler bite. She followed, mind churning with questions. Where had this Mustang come from? Why was it here? Deep down, she felt that this encounter was not random at all. The path Haven chose wove between outcroppings of jagged stone, where twisted roots jutted from the canyon walls like arthritic fingers. Loose pebbles skittered under Riley's boots, and an errant gust of wind carried a sharp chill, as if warning her that Raven's Hollow was no easy place to wander. She couldn't help but glance behind now and then. Each time, Haven kept a consistent distance ahead, ensuring she never lost sight of its swishing tail. As she ventured deeper, the canyon walls grew taller, pressing in on both sides. The sky above was reduced to a long slash of dusk. Her pulse quickened, though not entirely from fear. There was a sense of entering a hidden realm, a place untouched by the usual rhythms of farmland and the hum of distant highways. It felt older, primal, as if the land itself bore memories of countless footsteps that had passed through. Evidence of previous travelers soon became apparent. A splintered wooden post, leaning askew, the remnants of old footprints etched in dried mud, and even a discarded tin can rusted beyond recognition. Someone had been here before, maybe more than one someone, though it was impossible to guess how long ago. Riley touched the top of the worn post with a pang of curiosity. What had brought them here, and why had they left in such apparent haste? Haven pressed onward. At a fork in the path where a makeshift sign had once stood, only a rotten stump of wood remained. Without hesitation, the Mustang veered left, giving Riley no time to consider alternatives. She stifled a wry grin. "You certainly know where you're going," she murmured. "Who taught you this?" Her mind raced with possibility. Had Haven once belonged to someone stationed out here, or was it truly wild? A descendant of long-ago cavalry horses that roamed free across the west. The latter scenario seemed likely, but this horse's calm intelligence suggested it had, at some point, known human hand. Soon the terrain turned harsher. The trail narrowed to a precarious ribbon cut into the stone, forcing Riley to brace herself against the rock face. Pebbles clattered into the canyon depths with each careful step. She nearly lost her footing on a loose patch of gravel, her stomach lurching as she slid a few inches. At that moment, Haven halted on a higher ledge, ears pricked, its gaze locked onto Riley, neither panicked nor indifferent. It simply waited. A shiver rippled up her spine, part awe, part gratitude. She steadied herself and resumed the climb, inching forward despite her pounding heart. Reaching Haven's level, she exhaled, fighting the urge to laugh at her own adrenaline rush. Somehow, after that near mishap, the Mustang allowed her to approach close enough to lay a light hand on its neck. The creature's coat felt coarse, yet warm beneath the dust and tangles, and for a second she sensed the flicker of trust that passed between them. Light faded rapidly. The sun fell behind the canyon rim, flooding the ravine with deep oranges and purples. With each step, the world grew darker, but there was also a hypnotic beauty to it. The fractured angles of the stone glowed under the last rays, transforming the canyon floor into a mosaic of shadows. Riley saw the next turn open up onto a wider ledge. From that vantage point, the final fingers of sunlight revealed the silhouette of a structure down below. A squat building with collapsed sections of roof and battered walls. Her breath caught at the sight. She couldn't read the lettering from this distance, but she saw the outline of what appeared to be a sign mounted near the top. Haven stopped at the edge of this broad plateau, as if presenting her with the spectacle. The building looked abandoned. No lights or sounds emanating from within. Even so, something about it spoke of official use. The shape too uniform to be a simple shack. Squinting, she managed to discern a faint scrawl on a rusted metal plate. Sentinel Post, 12. The name stirred a sense of foreboding. A border outpost, perhaps. Or an old military station. Riley's mind conjured a dozen reasons it might be here. Surveillance, patrol, or something else entirely. Heart pounding. She inched closer. A rusty chain hung across what seemed to be the main door, though she could tell from the scuffs in the dirt that it had been disturbed recently. Heaven stood still a few yards behind her, exhaling a quiet breath as though it had done its duty. Riley gazed back at the Mustang. "This is what you brought me here for?" she asked softly. The horse blinked but did not move. With trembling curiosity, she advanced. Each footstep felt charged with possibility. She was no stranger to ruined buildings. She had traversed bombed-out compounds overseas. But this decaying post in her own Montana backyard struck her in a different way. There was a story here waiting for someone to uncover it. She placed a hand on the corroded padlock. Something about it looked recently tampered with. Scrapes of metal that seemed new in contrast to the deeper layers of rust. Her pulse quickened again. Had someone else come here, just days or weeks before? If so, where were they now? Turning back, she saw Haven standing a short distance away, ears half-cocked in quiet watchfulness. It seemed unwilling or uninterested in following her inside. Perhaps in the horse's mind its role was simply to guide whatever might lie beyond the locked door. It would be her task to discover alone. Riley swallowed. "Guess you're done leading me," she murmured. The last band of sunlight shrank behind the distant ridge, and the canyon descended into twilight. A faint odor reached Riley's nostrils the moment she circled the building, searching for an alternate way in. It was an odd mix of damp mustiness, rusted metal, and something else organic, almost like decaying foliage, but sharper. At the back of the structure, she found a small side entrance made of corroded steel, its hinges half torn from the frame. Ducking her head and shining her flashlight inside, she saw piles of debris, toppled shelves, smashed wooden crates, peeling papers scattered across the ground. Then her flashlight beam fell upon a human figure. A man lay crumpled on the floor, motionless, heart jamming in her throat. Riley dropped to her knees beside him. The flashlight revealed a middle-aged man, unkempt stubble covering his jaw, wearing a torn button-down shirt. His arms bore scratches, and his skin was dull with dehydration. At once her medic instinct surged forward. She pressed 2 fingers to the side of his neck. Weak pulse. At least he was alive. She noticed his cracked lips, sunken eyes, classic signs of severe dehydration. Carefully tilting his head back, she trickled a few drops of water from her canteen into his mouth. He sputtered, making a faint groan. His eyes fluttered beneath half-closed lids, but he didn't seem fully conscious yet. "Easy," Riley whispered. "I've got you." While supporting his head with a makeshift pad of her jacket, she checked for visible wounds. No major bleeding, though one forearm was badly bruised. Judging by his chafed wrists, he might have tried prying open something or dragging himself along the floor. She couldn't begin to imagine how long he'd been here. But if he was this dehydrated, it must have been days. A muffled exhalation escaped his lips, but the words were too garbled to discern. He needed proper medical attention. Rising unsteadily, Riley shone her flashlight around, searching for a better vantage point. The building's walls blocked any cell signal. Gently, she hoisted the man under his arms and half-carried, half-dragged him toward the front door, where the ground sloped upward. If she could get him higher, maybe she'd catch a phone signal. Out front, the chain-latched entrance offered a small patch of open sky above. Indeed, her phone flickered to life with a single bar of reception. Hastily, she dialed 911 and described the situation. An abandoned border outpost near Raven's Hollow. An unconscious man in need of immediate medical evacuation. She hesitated only once, pressing her lips together before adding, "I found him because a stray Mustang led me here." The operator's voice was matter-of-fact, asking for details about the terrain. The best approach for rescue vehicle. They would send a rescue squad and possibly a helicopter if the area was too difficult to reach by road. You'll likely have to guide them in, the dispatcher said. Can you hold out for 20 minutes? Riley glanced at the man. His eyelids fluttered as if caught in delirium. 20 minutes could be an eternity for someone in his condition. But at least the cavalry was on its way, she exhaled. I'll manage, she told the dispatcher. Just hurry. While waiting, she checked his vitals again, dribbling more water carefully between his cracked lip. He stirred a bit, eyes flickering open long enough for her to see they were a faded green. In a raspy whisper, he mumbled. The horse led you? She nodded, though she doubted he could fully process her response. Yes, she said softly. I wasn't going to come down here, but it showed up, almost like it wanted me to find you. A small frown crossed his forehead as if he were trying to make sense of it. Then he slumped back into a half-conscious haze. Beyond the building, the canyon began to fill with the hum of approaching vehicles. True to their word, the rescue team arrived in record time. An off-road ambulance, followed by a local deputy's SUV. Spotlights swept across the rocks. Paramedics rushed in with a stretcher. Riley helped them secure the man's neck and shoulder. Standing aside, she caught a glimpse of Haven, just far enough away to keep out of the circle of lights, but present nonetheless. The horse's eyes gleamed in the gathering dusk, its ears angled forward intently. The paramedics called the man's vitals. He's severely dehydrated, but stable enough to move. A deputy approached Riley, tipping his hat in a subdued greeting. Glad you got a signal if you hadn't found him. His voice trailed off, implying the obvious. The man likely wouldn't have survived another day. As they loaded him into the ambulance, the man, Caleb, someone murmured, managed a final whisper. Thank you both. Then the doors slammed shut, red and blue lights flashing across the canyon walls. Riley stepped back, relief and lingering adrenaline making her legs unsteady. Heaven let out a soft snort, as though acknowledging the success of this frantic rescue. Riley approached the horse slowly, the edges of her lips curving in a faint, awestruck smile. You brought me here, she said, voice shaking with wonder. Why? But Heaven only shook its mane and stared back, revealing no answers. When the rescue vehicles rumbled away, darkness descended once more, and the outpost's facade loomed silent. Riley laid a hand on Haven's neck, an unspoken gesture of gratitude. I guess we did good, she murmured. Whoever you are, the horse exhaled, warm breath against her sleeve, and in that silent exchange, she sensed the weight of a world she still didn't understand. No matter, tonight, they'd saved a life. Tomorrow would bring more questions. For now, this was enough. A pale fog clung to the streets of Iron Pass on the morning. Riley drove into town, making the silhouettes of trees and buildings blur at the edges. 3 days had passed since she helped rescue the man named Caleb Rourke from the abandoned border outpost, and she hadn't been able to get him off her mind. Now, as she pulled into the modest parking lot of Iron Pass Medical Center, the early sun barely filtered through the Inside, the small hospital was quiet, except for the occasional beep of monitors. Riley navigated a short hallway until she reached a room with its door propped open. Her gaze landed on Caleb lying in bed, his color much improved since the day she found him. An IV drip ran into his arm, and bandages swathed his left wrist and ankle. He looked up at her with a tired but genuine smile. I never expected anyone to find me, he said, in a raspy voice. A slight flush rose in his cheeks, as though he felt embarrassed admitting it. Riley stepped closer, pulling a chair beside the bed. I didn't expect to follow a wild horse into a canyon, she replied, her tone dry. We're even. A flicker of amusement crossed his face. Despite the exhaustion beneath his eyes, there was a warmth there, gratitude beyond word. She noticed fresh stubble trimmed around his jaw, and the faint lines that hinted at a life spent outdoors. Whatever ordeal he'd endured, he was recovering well. The sight set her at ease, though it sparked an undercurrent of curiosity. Why had he gone to Sentinel Post 12 in the first place? Caleb cleared his throat, as if bracing himself for a conversation he'd rehearsed in his mind. My name is Caleb Rourke. I used to serve in the Northwest Border Patrol. I left about 5 years ago, but I was born and raised around here. Well, near enough that Montana feels like home. He hesitated, gaze drifting to the window. My father, Elias Rourke, was stationed at Sentinel Post 12 decades ago. He disappeared from my life. Really, no calls, No letters. Then he died a while back. And that was that. Riley nodded but didn't interrupt. She'd encountered many veterans who carried familial rifts, unspoken regrets. It was a familiar pattern. Caleb continued, voice hoarse. Recently I received an old trunk he left behind. It contained scattered notes, half-finished letters, and a map referencing the post. There were cryptic hints, something about a cover-up, or an incident that took place at that border station. His brow furrowed, as though recalling the frustration. It's like he wanted me to piece together a puzzle, but never gave me the final clue. His father's silence had weighed on him for years. Yet, as he spoke, Riley sensed a deeper motive. So you came back to Montana to track down that story, she said quietly. Not for glory or closure in a happy sense, but he exhaled, letting the words, I just want to know who my father truly was. If Sentinel Post had something to do with him distancing himself from the family, I need to understand that. If he did something wrong, or saw something that haunted him, I want to shed light on it. A pang of empathy nudged at Riley's chest. She had lost her own mother without ever asking the questions that truly mattered. She understood the ache of wanting answers from the dead. For a moment they shared the silence of two souls who had returned home, each chasing shadows of their past. Caleb's tone shifted, more matter of fact, as though he were reporting a case. I set off for the post last weekend. I'd been rummaging through Dad's trunk and found references to an underground storage area that might hold old reports. My plan was to investigate, gather any files, maybe find a lead on what actually happened. He rubbed his bandaged wrist, expression wry. The place was already in bad shape. Doors rusted, hinges on the verge of collapse. I had water and some rations. Figured I'd spend a day or two. But on the first night, a windstorm whipped through the canyon. One of the doors slammed with enough force to break the hinge and jam the lock from the inside. My phone had no signal, and I couldn't pry the door open without risking the entire frame caving in. Riley's mind flashed to the battered state of the entrance she'd seen. It must have taken a fierce gust indeed. You weren't panicked. Not at first. He admitted, I'm ex-border patrol, so I've dealt with rough conditions. But after 2 days of trying every escape route, my supplies ran low. Dehydration set in. I started feeling lightheaded, losing track of time. By day 4, I was delirious. Before I blacked out, I swear I heard hooves and a woman's voice. Turned out it wasn't just a dream. Riley crossed her arms. It really was a horse that led me there. A Mustang I've named Haven. A faint grin tugged at his lips. Haven? Huh? I guess that's fitting. Had it not shown up, I'd be a corpse in that god-forsaken outpost by now. She didn't deny it. The question still nagged her. Why that horse? Why her? But Caleb continued, voice dropping. Any idea why it might have? I can't explain it, Riley said simply, recounting how she'd found Haven near the southern fence, how the Mustang had watched her with an uncanny intensity, then guided her all the way through Raven's Hollow to Sentinel Post. After I pulled you out of that place, Haven disappeared for a while. I can't be sure if it's truly wild or if it once belonged to someone stationed there. Caleb absorbed her words in thoughtful silence. After a moment he muttered, maybe it used to roam that post. Maybe it belonged to someone who died out there. The notion struck a chord in both of them, a quiet, uneasy possibility. Imagining a horse carrying the memory of a place long forsaken. I don't know, Riley repeated, choosing not to dwell on the more unsettling theories. All I know is that it had a reason. Caleb pressed his lips together. His gaze dropped to the IV line. Well, I owe that horse my life. And I owe you. Once I'm back on my feet, I'm heading there again. I need to figure out what my father hid from me. Riley didn't say yes or no immediately, but somewhere in her chest, she recognized a spark of empathy and agreement. A few days later, while Caleb still convalesced, Riley found herself standing in the ranch yard at dawn, eyes fixed on the horizon. She had promised to wait for him to recover, but a restless urgency gnawed at her. If the outpost held secrets tied to Elias Rourke's past, she wanted to get a clearer picture before Caleb faced it again. There was a chance the truth might hurt him more than he anticipated. As though sensing her decision, Haven appeared by the damaged fence line that very morning. Tail flicked. Riley couldn't help a faint smile. It was as if the Mustang had been waiting, ready to guide her for a second time. Slipping on a jacket and boots, she filled a saddlebag with supplies, extra water, a small first aid kit, rope and a flashlight. She wouldn't be trapped like Caleb had been. Before leaving, she jotted a note for Caleb in case he tried to find her. "I need to check something at Sentinel Post. Don't worry, I won't do anything crazy." Folding it neatly, she placed it on the kitchen table. Then, with a resolute breath, she set off for Raven's Hollow. Haven strolling a short distance behind. The trip down the canyon in full daylight felt surprisingly different. Sunlight poured across the stone walls, revealing layers of striated rock that glowed in hues of orange and oak. The path was just as treacherous, but the bright clarity eased the tension. Where dusk had cloaked everything in an ominous hush, midday transformed the outpost below into a haunting ruin that beckoned with silent story. Sentinel Post 12 emerged from behind a rocky protrusion, the battered sign faintly visible in the glare. Now, Riley noticed details that had escaped her before. A second-story window, broken but still framed by battered shutters, and a side shed with half its roof missing. She also picked up signs of past human presence, footprints half faded in the dirt. A rusted coffee can perched on a windowsill. The outpost had once been alive with routine. The daily logs, radio calls, shifts changing at odd hours. Now it sat like a tomb for lost time. She tried the front door. Though the chain and padlock remained, they were more pliable in broad daylight. Nudging it aside, she slipped in, stepping carefully over the warped threshold. Haven lingered outside, snorting quietly as though standing watch. The main floor, which she'd partly explored the last time, consisted of a reception area with an old radio on a desk, a cracked map pinned to the wall, and scattered papers across the floor. She guessed there had been a makeshift living space for overnight staff, perhaps to rest between shifts. Dust motes drifted through beams of sunlight from narrow gaps in the boarded windows. A narrow staircase led to a second level. The boards groaned under her weight, but they held. At the top, the corridor opened onto two small rooms, a storage area and an attic-like space beneath a sloping roof. She tested the handle of the attic door. It creaked, and a musty odor wafted out. Inside, the ceiling angled sharply, forcing her to stoop. The space was cluttered with battered filing boxes, sagging wooden shelves, and a haphazard stack of dusty tar. In the far corner, half obscured by a heap of old blankets, she found a steel chest. The lock was so rusted that it cracked off with a single pull. Crouching, she lifted the lid. Her gaze settled on an array of documents, letters bound by brittle rubber band, spiral notebooks that appeared to be logs or shift schedules, scattered maps drawn on yellowing paper, and small personal effects, a tarnished dog tag, a half-crumpled photograph. Every piece felt like it belonged to an era no one had bothered to remember. One large envelope bore handwriting in bold marker: "Never send. Do not let Caleb read, unless he truly needs to." Riley's chest tightened. Did Elias Rourke write these words? She set the envelope aside for a moment. Leafing through almost every item pointed to official records from the post. Weekly patrol summaries, incidents with border crossers, reports of routine checks. The dryness of bureaucratic language barely masked the tension beneath each typed line. Carefully, she took out the envelope. Her hands trembled. This was presumably the key to understanding what Elias had hidden from his son. Guilt pricked at her conscience. She was invading a private legacy. Yet she pressed on. Caleb had a right to know. Eventually, as Riley turned to retrieve her flashlight from where she'd set it, the wooden planks beneath her gave a sharp crack. She tried to shift her weight, but it was too late. With a splintering groan, a section of the attic floor caved in. She tumbled through a shower of broken boards and debris, striking her right arm against a battered beam. Pain flared as she landed on the level below with a thud. Boards raining around her. Dazed, she gasped for breath, each inhale sending a throb of agony through her bruised rib. The steel chest and documents toppled near her, scattering papers across the dusty floor. For a panicked second, she wondered if the entire outpost would cave in. Above, a ragged hole gaped in the attic ceiling. A loud, piercing neigh shattered the silence. Heaven! The horse must have heard the crash. She heard the stomp of hooves near an outer wall, the frantic sound echoing as if the Mustang tried to break through. Grimacing, Riley pushed aside splintered boards and tested her limbs. Her right arm was scraped, blood trickling down, but her bones seemed intact. Her left calf throbbed where it had slammed into a table corner, yet she managed to stand on shaky legs. Okay, I'm all right, she mumbled under her breath, though the pounding in her skull said otherwise. She staggered to the nearest window, peering out. Through the grimy glass, she glimpsed Haven rearing and pawing at the dirt by the side entrance. The horse let out another anxious neigh. She forced a shaky grin. I'm alive. You crazy animal, just give me a minute. As she tried to gather the scattered papers, Riley noticed one particular sheet lying face down on the dusty floor. No envelope, no label. When she flipped it over, she recognized Elias Rourke's handwriting immediately. It matched the scrawl on the large envelope in the chest. But this letter was addressed more personally. Caleb, if you're reading this, it means you found the post. Maybe even learned what I did. There's something I never told you. Riley's breath caught as she skimmed the lines. It described a grim event. Elias had once witnessed a horrifying incident at the border. An abuse of authority that went against every principle of human decency. Rather than speak up, he had chosen silence. The letter detailed how a group of migrants had been left unprotected, leading to suffering and possibly death. Elias wrote, I told myself I was just following orders, but that doesn't erase the guilt. I can't face you, and I can't face my own conscience. If you ever learn this truth, please do something better than what I did. Don't turn away. Riley's chest tightened. No wonder he never told Caleb. She suspected this might forever change Caleb's view of his father. The weight of that knowledge prickled at her nerve. Would revealing it now help or break him further? Gathering the loose pages, Riley stuffed them carefully into her jacket. She limped outside where Haven stood in the threshold, ears pinned forward in concern. The horse locked eyes with her, as if demanding an explanation. I don't think it's time to show him, she murmured. Some truths, if they come too soon, only make things worse. Haven snorted softly, then turned its head aside, as though in reluctant agreement. Riley exhaled, her mind a swirl of guilt and resolve. She'd found the key to Elias Rourke's secret, and for now, she would keep it locked away. It was a crisp morning 10 days after Caleb's stay in the hospital, when he finally found himself standing by the weathered wooden gate of Morrigan Ranch. A thin mist clung to the edges of the fence posts, catching the first rays of dawn. Though his ankle was still wrapped in a supportive bandage and his wrist bore a brace, he looked markedly healthier, more color in his cheeks, more certainty in his stance. Riley Morrigan stepped forward from the porch. I meant what I said, she told him, voice steady. This place has more space than I need. Stay as long as you like. Caleb shifted the single backpack slung over his shoulder, glancing at the modest suitcase that held the few belongings he'd brought from the hospital. I appreciate it, he replied, genuine gratitude lacing his tone. I know it's abrupt, but you need time. She finished for him, and maybe a bit of distance from that outpost. She led him inside, past the living room with its fireplace and the faded picture of her mother resting on the mantel. Down a short hallway, she opened the door to a cozy room of pine walls, a neat bed, and a small nightstand beside a lantern-style lamp. Simple, but comfortable. Caleb noticed the faint scent of lemon polish, evidence that she'd cleaned it recently, as he set his backpack down. He felt a wave of relief at having a quiet place to heal physically and mentally. He leaned on the temporary crutch the hospital had issued, making his way around the room. Riley lingered at the threshold. There's coffee in the kitchen whenever you want, she said, matter of fact, and if you need help, just ask. Caleb nodded. Thanks, I owe you. Riley, she gave a curt nod, uncertain how to respond, then left him to settle in. Those first few days at Morrigan Ranch passed in a slow, deliberate rhythm. Each morning, Riley rose at dawn to start a pot of strong coffee, one she always made enough of, so that a portion would be left on the table for Caleb. She'd leave him a quick note, scrawled in pencil, take it easy on the ankle, or be back from the stables soon. Caleb, still adapting to the crutch, would hobble into the kitchen to find the coffee waiting. It became a small, comforting ritual, coffee steaming in chipped mugs, the ranch wrapped in sunrise. After his first cup, he'd make his way outside, guided by the sound of Riley talking softly to the horses. He'd see her in the corral, raking away old straw or tossing fresh hay. She rarely paused in her tasks. If she noticed him, she'd offer a single nod, and he'd nod back. Initially, he was too unsteady to do much. Riley suggested small chores, wiping the old windows, sweeping the porch, or trimming weeds by the fence. The tasks were straightforward, yet they grounded him in a way he hadn't expected. Each swirl of the broom or tug of the clippers reminded him of simpler times, unburdened by the secrets lurking at Sentinel Post. Bit by bit, they developed an unspoken rhythm. When she said, "Hay's over there," he'd nod, responding with a quiet, "I'll handle it." If he had trouble with his wrist or lost balance, she'd appear at his side. No fuss or admonition, just a steady presence. Her instructions came in succinct bursts that he found oddly reassuring. "That shovel is by the left corner. That black mare doesn't like sudden moves. Approach from the side." At midday, they'd break for a quick bite in the kitchen. Sometimes the meal was as plain as sandwiches or leftover stew. Neither was a gourmet cook, but they shared an understanding. The ranch's daily work left no room for frivolities, yet there was comfort in these small shared routines. Through each gesture, like Caleb fastening a loose hinge before a gust of wind could tear the door off, or Riley leaving a folded towel on the porch rail, they built a fragile but growing trust. It was not a boisterous companionship. They spoke only what needed saying, letting their actions fill the silences with mutual respect. One rainy afternoon tested the synergy they were slowly nurturing. A steady downpour drummed on the roof, leaking through a rotted patch near the stables. Standing under the eaves, Caleb gazed up at the missing shingles. "We should seal that before it gets worse," he suggested, looking to Riley for confirmation. She only nodded. Together they dragged a ladder across the muddy yard. Riley took the higher vantage, climbing to the roof with a bundle of shingles and a worn hammer, while Caleb remained below, bracing the ladder and handing supplies up as needed. About halfway through the repair, the ladder wobbled. Riley's foot slipped, sending a piece of shingle clattering. Caleb barked, "Careful," in a voice sharper than he'd ever used around her. Her heart thumped, but she steadied herself quickly. Drips of water slid down her collar, the cold making her shiver, yet she simply peered over the edge with a faint grin. "Relax," she said Riley. "I've crawled through mortar-blasted tunnels. This is child's play." Her calm under pressure eased the tension in his chest. Still, he gripped the ladder a little tighter. The possibility of her getting injured ignited a pang of concern he hadn't expected. Perhaps because, in this short time, he'd started to rely on her no-nonsense presence. She finished patching the roof while he held the ladder firmly, raindrops peppering them both. Later that evening, they warmed themselves indoors with bread and sliced ham, occasionally glancing out the window at the sheets of rain. Beyond the fence, Haven stood in the gloom, water streaming off its mottled coat. "I've never believed in fate," Riley remarked softly, eyes on the horse. "But that animal, it changed the pace of my life." Caleb turned to look, a thoughtful expression crossing his face. He suspected there was more she wanted to say about it. Perhaps about her nights grappling with half-buried memories, or how she was learning to let someone else be part of her routine. But silence prevailed, and they finished their meal while Haven kept silent vigil in the rainy twilight. It was a different kind of evening when their quiet acceptance finally cracked to reveal a deeper understanding. Darkness had settled across the ranch, the lantern on the porch casting a narrow cone of light onto the wooden step. Caleb sat outside, a battered notebook in his lap, one that belonged to his father, containing fleeting mentions of patrol shifts and cryptic notes about regrets. He stared at the scribbled words under the dim glow, lost in thought. Then Riley emerged from the doorway, a steaming mug of tea in her hand, which she placed gently on the step beside him. She noticed the tension in his posture, the tight line of his jaw, and asked nothing at first. Eventually, Caleb slid the notebook shut. "There was a time," he began quietly, "when I left a soldier behind. I was convinced he couldn't be saved. Then I found out he actually survived. He never spoke to me again." His voice shook with suppressed guilt. "I was so sure I was making the right call, but I made it alone." Riley lowered herself onto the step, feeling the planks creak beneath her weight. A breeze carried the scent of hay and distant pine. "In Iraq," she said after a moment, voice low, "I held a boy's hand while he died. We couldn't save him. He was maybe 10, sometimes at night. I still hear him calling for his mother. Their shared confessions hung in the air, raw and unadorned. Neither tried to comfort the other with platitudes. Perhaps comfort wasn't what they needed. Acknowledgement was. Eventually, Caleb rose, as though needing to pace away from the heaviness of the memory. He paused at the porch edge, eyes flicking back to her. "Thank you," he murmured, "for listening." She nodded, fully aware that no grand words of solace existed for burdens like these. As days turned to weeks, that fragile connection between Riley and Caleb began to strengthen. One afternoon, while Riley was grooming a skittish mare, she glanced over to see Caleb approach Haven. She tensed, half expecting the Mustang to shy away. Haven typically only allowed Riley close, but this time the horse stayed still, lifting its head attentively. When Caleb reached out to rest his hand on Haven's neck, the animal snorted softly, but did not retreat. Riley paused mid-brush, observing from a distance. There was something quietly profound in the way Haven accepted Caleb's touch. She felt a rush of conflicting emotions, pride that Haven was warming to him, coupled with a strange flicker of vulnerability. That evening, after stabling the horses, she wrote a single line in her late mother's old journal. "There are people we don't choose, but fate places them in our lives regardless." Increasingly, small pockets of warmth brightened the ranch's once lonely atmosphere. For example, Caleb discovered that Riley had a surprisingly infectious laugh when something truly amused her, like the time a mischievous gray filly tipped its feeding trough, spilling a mess across the corral. Her laugh was rare, yet when it appeared, it lit her features in a way that made him catch his breath. Likewise, Riley noticed how carefully Caleb watched over the property, as though determined to shield it from any further harm. She'd catch him scanning the perimeter fence or stepping into the barn at night to check on the horses, ensuring the latches were secure. He didn't hover, but she felt the weight of his attentiveness, shaped by years of caution and regret. They never labeled their relation. Both had endured enough uniform and protocol to know that human connections rarely fit neat definitions. The ranch house, once heavy with Riley's solitude, now echoed with quiet footsteps and the shuffle of two separate lives weaving into a shared tapestry. They fixed squeaky doors, patched leaky roofs, and even replaced a few rotten porch boards side by side. Yet it was more than practical chores. It was the slow forging of trust between two people who'd lost much and were learning to stand upright again. By the end of each day, they found themselves under the same worn porch light, sipping tea or quietly reflecting on how far they'd come. The hush of the Montana night enveloped them, and in that hush, they recognized an unspoken bond. Neither had actively sought companionship, but in the stillness of Morrigan Ranch, they realized they were no longer alone. One crisp morning, after chores were done, Caleb unrolled a large sheet of paper across the ranch kitchen table. Riley, wiping her hands on a towel, raised an eyebrow. "What's that?" He tapped the rough sketch. "I pulled together some old notes and a floor plan of Sentinel Post. I've been thinking we should fix it up. Not as a home, but as a place that acknowledges what happened there." Riley's brows furrowed in mild skepticism. "You mean patch the holes and replace the roof so it's not just an abandoned ruin?" "Exactly," Caleb said. "I don't want to glorify it. This isn't about painting my father as a hero. It's about letting the place speak its truth. People can come and see it for what it was and is." She stood there quietly for a beat. He expected pushback, but she surprised him. "I'll help," she said at last, her voice soft but resolute. "But if we're doing this, we do it well. No half measures." A flicker of relief shone in his eyes. "Agreed. We'll need supplies, wood, roofing materials, nails, a generator for power." "It's a tall order," but Riley cut in. "We start by clearing the debris. Then we shore up any structural issues. If we don't fix the foundation, all the rest is for nothing." His lips curved into a faint grin. He appreciated her no-nonsense approach. Spoken like someone who's built more than a few fences. She shrugged, looking almost bashful. "I grew up around this stuff." Her gaze flicked toward the small window beyond which the ranch yard sprawled. "Let's do it." Outside, a distant neigh from Haven echoed, as if the Mustang were giving its blessing. By midweek, they had assembled enough basic tools, face masks, work gloves, shovels, and a pickup loaded with planks, tarps, and other repair material. The journey down Raven's Hollow felt less ominous this time, though the winding track still tested their truck's suspension. Haven followed at a leisurely pace on the dusty trail, neither leading nor lagging, just present. When they reached Sentinel Post 12, the old structure stood bathed in morning light. Caleb gazed at it, recalling the day he nearly died here. The locked door, the collapsed ceiling, the stifling air that pressed in on him during his final hours of consciousness. Now he had returned not to rummage for secrets, but to resurrect the building in a transparent, honest way. First step, remove debris, Riley announced, pulling on her gloves. Her tone reminded him of the time she'd meticulously outlined a medical procedure or a stable chore. She always broke tasks down into clear, executable steps. He found comfort in it. They worked systematically. Caleb tackled the ground floor, hauling out rotted beams and fallen boards, many still wet from the elements seeping in. He uncovered old framed maps hidden beneath the rubble. The glass cracked, but the parchment intact. An ancient radio lay half buried in the corner, its antenna bent. He carefully set these items aside. Some might become displays or references for the memorial. Meanwhile, Riley focused on the battered door frames and window, prying off useless shards. Every strike of her hammer reverberated in the dusty hall, a stark counterpoint to the hush that had once swallowed the building. With each swing, she felt a twinge of symbolic release, like exorcising the silence that clung to these walls. Haven, free of any tether, wandered in and out of the open door, stepping gingerly around shards of wood. Sometimes it hovered near Caleb, ears flicking at each new discovery. At other times, it ambled beside Riley, as if checking her progress. When they paused for water breaks, the horse would stand between them, muzzle dipping curiously at the pile of discarded boards. By the day's end, the post's main room was no longer cluttered with debris. The two surveyed their work, sweat-streaked and achingly aware of how much remained. Even so, a sense of purpose buoyed them, bridging the gap between a tragic past and a hopeful future. News traveled fast in a small town like Iron Path. Within a week of Caleb and Riley beginning renovations at Sentinel Post, whispers circulated around Clara's cafe, the local hardware store, and even the school playground. Some ex-military folks are cleaning up that old border outpost. People would say he nearly died in there, but now he's fixing it up. That was typically followed by a mention of a mysterious horse that seemed to watch over them. One afternoon, as they unloaded fresh lumber from the back of the pickup, an SUV rumbled up the dusty path. Out stepped Helen Briggs, the cheerful cafe owner, holding 2 thermoses and a neatly wrapped pack of pastries. "Heard you two have been at it all day. Brought a little pick-me-up." Her eyes glinted with curiosity as she scanned the battered building. If that place once saved lives, it deserves not to be left for dead, right? Caleb thanked her, taking the thermoses while Riley peeled back the pastry pack to reveal sweet buns drizzled with icing. The smell alone felt like a salve for their tired spirit. Helen nodded approvingly, then offered a short wave and returned to her SUV, content that she'd contributed in some small way. The local elementary school pitched in as well. An impromptu art project emerged, where kids drew pictures of horses and the outpost. Teachers pinned these colorful depictions to a board labeled Iron Pass Heritage, and word reached the 2 crafters at Sentinel Post. Soon enough, Caleb found himself grinning at a child's scribbled version of a big gray horse, with the note, "Thank you for saving Mr. Caleb." As the days rolled on, more people arrived, sometimes just dropping off supplies in the early morning. Pieces of plywood, boxes of nails, spare tarps, most left quietly, perhaps shy or unsure how to express support. Riley was struck by their silent generosity. They all recognized that these efforts might unravel a complicated history, but they also saw the value in preserving it. Leaning on a newly erected post, Caleb murmured, "I thought this place was forgotten." Riley slipped a coil of rope off her shoulder, a thoughtful half-smile on her lip. "Maybe sometimes you just have to knock again for people to open the door." He chuckled, "Guess so. Hard to stay hidden in a town like Iron Pass." The slow but steady arrival of help reflected an emerging collective belief. Out of ruin could come renewal, and no story, no matter how grim, deserved to vanish unacknowledged. After several weeks of relentless work, They reached a milestone that felt both symbolic and deeply personal, rehanging the worn-out sign bearing the words, Sentinel. Caleb had carefully sanded off the worst of the splinters, while Riley repainted the lettering, deliberately preserving the original style and cracks. The result was a curious blend of old and new, the name clearly legible again, but still showing the scars of time. On a clear midday, they lifted the sign back into place above the front entrance. The wooden facade had been reinforced with fresh beams, so it supported the sign without creaking. For a moment, Caleb gazed at it, swallowing a lump in his throat. This place had nearly claimed his life, and had hidden pieces of his father's truth. Now it proclaimed itself anew, no longer a decaying secret, but a testament to honesty. Riley gave him a nudge. "We should hoist a flag." "Two," she said, her voice quiet but confident. "Not a military one. Something that stands for what this has become." They settled on a white cloth, improvised from a spare canvas sheet, onto which they painted a stylized hoof print and two clasped hands, with a sturdy makeshift flagpole positioned near the entrance. The cloth fluttered in the light breeze. On it, the hoof print represented Haven's role as a guide, while the entwined hand symbolized human connection, bridging the gap between memory and healing, as though sensing the significance. Haven trotted closer, raising its head toward the new flag. Caleb couldn't help a small smile. "Look at that," approval from the guardian horse. Riley smirked softly. "Figures, he's been the one watching over us from the start." Together, they stepped back to admire their progress. Sentinel Post 12, once battered by years of neglect, now boasted a rebuilt roof, reinforced walls and open windows with newly fitted but modest panes. It remained humble, not polished, to a sheen, yet enough to stand tall and welcome any curious visitor seeking a glimpse into its path. The main interior room was cleared of debris and thoroughly swept. There, they placed a long wooden table near the largest window, leaving enough space around it for display. Caleb's vision was to showcase the old documents and photos that reflected both the official operations of Sentinel Post and the personal stories connected to it. He had photocopied some of the original letters and logs, keeping certain more sensitive ones private for now, to give visitors a window into what life had been like here years ago. Riley helped arrange these documents in simple frames. Beside them, she pinned up a chronological list of key events gleaned from the station's logs: routine patrols, inclement weather incidents, a handful of emergencies. In the corner, she set a battered trunk once used for storing uniform. Anyone who lifted the lid would find a handful of artifacts: a tin cup, a broken compass, a tattered patch from a disbanded platoon. Each item had once been mundane, but placed in this new context, they formed a quiet mosaic of history. Along one wall, Caleb used chalk to sketch a map of the surrounding canyon and its approach routes. He marked specific places where noteworthy incidents had occurred: a collapsed bridge, a rendezvous point used by patrol. This large map allowed visitors to orient themselves in the story of the station, seeing how the geography shaped both routine checks and tragic oversight. Finally, near the entrance, they set a modest wooden box with a sign that read, "If you or someone you know served here, feel free to leave a note or memory. Every story mattered." At first, the box remained empty, but as word spread, people began to slip folded papers through the slot, some with names or short anecdotes, others with longer recollections from parents or grandparents. One note simply read, "My dad told me about seeing a horse stuck in barbed wire near this post when he was a teenager. He cut it free. I wonder if that was Haven's ancestor." Watching the box fill up day by day, Riley felt a subtle warmth in her chest. By turning the outpost into a living memorial, they were honoring not just the official records, but the human and sometimes equine stories that had woven themselves into this land. A mild storm rolled through one afternoon, the wind rattling the newly fitted window. Riley had gone out to check if the roof repairs would hold under the strain, but when she arrived, she spotted Haven standing at the threshold of the outpost, head lowered as though blocking the entrance from the gust. The horse's stance was nearly regal, its mane whipped around by swirling air, yet it held firm, as if guarding what was now a sacred place. The next morning, as they tidied leftover debris, Caleb carried out a small wooden plaque he had carved. He secured it on a post near the entrance. The inscription, wood burned into the surface, read, "Haven the Guide." Kids from Iron Pass, passing by with parents or teachers, took to calling Haven the canyon's guardian horse, or the spirit of Raven's Hollow. Some even swore the horse wore an expression of mild benevolence whenever they approached. Riley privately marveled at how the once lonely Mustang had become an emblem for hope in the eyes of the townspeople. Perhaps it was simply the allure of a horse that seemed so free, yet so intimately bound to a cause. Though never bridled or fenced in, Haven often returned to the outpost each morning. It would roam the area, graze in the scrub grass, then station itself near the entrance by late afternoon, as if waiting for any new visitors to arrive. In a short span of weeks, the horse had gone from an unknown wanderer to an integral piece of Sentinel Post story, a living, breathing testament that even a forsaken place could find renewal through unexpected connections. A low murmur filled the small meeting hall on Iron Pass's main street, as Caleb, Riley, and a handful of townsfolk gathered around an old wooden table. The dim overhead light cast wobbly shadows across the laminated map of what was once known as Sentinel Post. For several months, the refurbished outpost had quietly drawn curious visitors, but now people talked of making it truly official. "We should rename the place," suggested one of the older veterans, a man named Raleigh who had served in a different outpost long ago. "Sentinel Post is just a technical label. It never felt like something people could connect with." Riley leaned forward, elbows on the table. She caught Caleb's eye. They had discussed this in private, the idea that the outpost needed an identity that spoke to more than just a cold military past. "Let's call it Rourke's Stand," she said. The simple phrase hung in the air. A stand made by someone who refused to run from his memory, someone ready to turn them into something meaningful. Caleb's gaze fell to the map. He recalled the letter his father had never sent, the guilt and the regrets that once haunted these walls. After a moment, he nodded. "If anyone deserves a real place of remembrance," he said quietly, "it's all those who kept silent their whole lives. My father included." No one objected. The name felt human, personal, resonant. A stand was where you planted your feet, braced yourself, and refused to abandon a cause or a memory. By attaching the Rourke name, it subtly honored Elias's hidden truth, while granting it a second life. The group agreed that from this day on, the outpost was no longer simply Post 12. It was Rourke's Stand, open to whoever wished to learn its history or share in its transformation. On a clear Sunday morning in early autumn, Rourke's Stand opened its doors to the public for the very first time. There was no ribbon-cutting ceremony, no press conference, just a hand-lettered sign by the entrance reading, "Come on in, we have stories to share." By 9 o'clock, townsfolk were already trailing in slowly, adults in comfortable jackets, children tugging at their parents' sleeves in excitement. Riley found herself greeting an elderly couple who reminisced about hearing faint radio calls from the outpost decades before. Meanwhile, Caleb spoke with a small group of local veterans, their hushed voices weaving between shared war stories and the occasional joke about how they never thought they'd be back in uniform territory, even if only as visitors. Most eye-catching to the children was a large display board featuring images of Haven. The Mustang silhouette was sketched in charcoal by a local art student, accompanied by a few typed paragraphs about how it had guided Riley to rescue Caleb. The kids gathered around, pointing at the sketches and chattering excitedly. "Look, it's the horse that stands guard at the canyon. I heard it never lets anyone ride it. Do you think it understands us?" Some had drawn their own pictures, scribbly, colorful renditions of a noble horse with wide, knowing eyes, crayon flowers, big sunsets, and speech bubbles proclaiming, "I will help you," or "I found a friend," lined one corner of the main hall, taped up in a cheerful collage. One middle-aged woman approached a newly installed memorial wall with trembling hands. She placed a folded letter under a tack, whispering, "My father served with Elias Rourke. He never spoke of it. Now I know why." Caleb, observing from across the room, felt a swell of empathy. It reminded him that many families carried quiet burdens, and that Rourke's Stand might offer them a gentle place to unburden. By midday, the hall buzzed with subdued energy. People wandered among displays of recovered documents, old photographs, and tidbits of local history. Rather than a festivity, it felt more like a collective exhale, a careful stepping into a formerly sealed chapter. And through it all, Heaven roamed the grounds outside, greeting inquisitive children who ventured close enough to offer a pat or a carrot, living proof that even the wildest paths could lead to unexpected redemption. Late that afternoon, when the visitors had trickled out and the outpost quieted, Caleb stood alone in the main exhibit hall, lost in thought. Riley had stepped outside to speak with a retired teacher who wanted to bring her students for a field trip, with only the muted hum of the overhead lights for company. Caleb unzipped his backpack and withdrew a folded envelope. It was the letter from his father, the one Riley had discovered hidden in the attic and held onto until the renovations were nearly complete. The letter Elias Rourke had never sent. Caleb had read it once before but found himself compelled to revisit it, especially now that the outpost had a new name and a new purpose. He climbed the narrow stairs to the outpost's upper level, slipping into a small, half-furnished room with a single wooden desk and a worn chair. Sunlight filtered through cracks in the shutters, illuminating dancing dust motes. Caleb eased into the chair, leaning forward as he gently flattened the letter on the aged desktop. A breeze stirred the edges, carrying the stale odor of old wood and musty paper. In careful script, Elias had written, "Caleb, if you're reading this, then I'm likely gone. I once hoped to tell you all of this in person, but I was a coward every time the chance arose. There was a day at this outpost when I stood silent, allowing a group of migrants to be left behind across the canyon. A young soldier on watch wanted to go back for them, but I ordered him not to, citing regulations. The next morning, 3 of those people died from the cold. I always thought I'd tell you, but I never found the courage. If you've discovered this letter, please know I never intended for you to bear my shame. But if you do remember my mistake, try to make use of that memory. Let it become something better than what I allowed it to be." Caleb's eyes misted over as he traced the ink with his fingertips. The letter was both confession and plea, laced with regret too heavy to be spoken aloud in life. He breathed out shakily, recalling how he himself had once made a choice to abandon a soldier he believed was beyond saving. A decision that haunted him still. Perhaps father and son were more alike than he cared to admit. He folded the letter carefully, pressing it shut. Tears did not break from him in sobs. They merely pooled in the corners of his eyes. He placed a hand on the old wooden surface. This was the very desk his father had used. Quietly, he whispered, "I've done it already. Dad, I'm doing it now. I won't let your silence define us." The hall below remained silent, the exhibits bearing witness to this intimate moment. For the first time in years, Caleb felt that the distance between him and his father had shrunk. In the unspoken act of naming Rourke's stand, he was finally granting Elias a place where honesty and redemption could coexist. A sudden disturbance broke his reverie, the sound of hooves on the wooden threshold. Looking up, Caleb saw the unmistakable shape of Haven standing in the dim corridor. The late afternoon sunlight from outside cast a long, angled shadow across the floor, as though the horse carried a gentle glow into the old station. Rising from the desk, Caleb moved toward the hallway. Haven stepped forward, ears alert, as if it sensed the gravity of Caleb's mood. Slowly, Caleb placed a hand on its neck, feeling the steady warmth of muscle beneath the coarse coat. "My father never showed me the way," he murmured, voice thick with emotion. "But you did." In response, Haven gave a soft exhalation, lowering its head slightly, almost like a nod. It was a small moment, unremarkable to anyone outside, but for Caleb it brimmed with meaning. Here was a living symbol of second chances, of the improbable bridging of human regret and an animal's inexplicable guidance. From the far end of the corridor, Riley paused. Having quietly climbed the stairs, she saw the silhouette of Caleb and Haven, recognized the tenderness in the posture, and chose not to interrupt. Some corners of pain and memory had to be revisited in solitude, and she respected that boundary. If a door was closing on the old guilt, then a door to genuine peace was opening just as quietly. Over the following month, the transformation of Rourke's stand rippled through Iron Pass and beyond. The local newspaper ran a short feature titled, "An Old Outpost, New Memories, and the Horse That Led the Way." A photograph showed Caleb, Riley, and Haven standing at the main entrance, the rehung sign clearly declaring Rourke's stand. The coverage drew a modest but steady trickle of out-of-towners, former Border Patrol officers curious about their old workplace, local historians wanting to document the building's newly unveiled artifacts, and educators hoping to show students a living slice of Montana's complicated past. Clara, the cafe owner, capitalized on the interest by baking horseshoe-shaped pastries and handing them out free to any visitor who mentioned the outpost. The treat became a small icon of community pride. Each new arrival learned about the station's quiet resurrection, about the orchard of stories that blossomed after decades of silence. Despite the growing traffic, neither Caleb nor Riley took on the role of official guide. They remained present, often seen on the grounds or inside the station, answering questions with a calm honesty. But they let visitors discover the exhibits at their own pace. With the visitors came new stories. A woman who recognized her grandfather in an old photograph. A veteran who described nights spent patrolling along the canyon's edge. A young teacher who wanted her students to learn how empathy and accountability could reshape history. And through it all, heaven roamed the property, unworried by strangers. Its quiet acceptance of new faces only reinforced the outpost's emerging identity. Not a shrine to glory, but a place for reflection. Proof that acknowledging the past could yield a gentler present. What struck the onlookers most was how Rourke's stand refrained from promoting tales of valor or triumph. No bronze plaques recounted battles. No grand speeches heralded the station's achievement. Instead, the corridors were lined with personal accounts, letters, logs, confessions, and confusions. The central narrative was about redemption, the echoes of unspoken truths, and the slow weaving of healing across time. In one of her late-night journal entries, Riley penned a succinct thought. This place was a scar. Now it's become a seam. Seam was apt. It implied that the wound remained, yet it was stitched together, not hidden away. Heaven, by now a fixture of the outpost, embodied that seam, where once it prowled the canyon alone. It now meandered among visitors, a living reminder that even the wildest wanderers could find a corner of belonging without surrendering their freedom. Caleb and Riley never once referred to themselves as saviors or restorers. If asked, they'd simply shake their heads and say they'd had help from the horse, from the townspeople, from the logs and letters left by those who came before. This sense of collective ownership ensured that Rourke's stand was never overshadowed by the idea of individual heroics. It belonged to everyone who needed to see that a silent past could turn into a hopeful present. And so the building stood, walls patched and floors mended, a subtle testament to the power of facing regret without burying it. For those who paused to visit, Rourke's stand served as a reminder that if memories were carefully acknowledged, they might lead to a gentler tomorrow, rather than an endless echo of remorse. By the time winter brushed the edges of Montana with its first frosts, Caleb had long since stopped discussing any departure date from Morrigan Ranch. Riley never asked him about moving on, and he never brought it up. Day by day, the ranch became as much his home as her. Each dawn, they both rose to the hush of pre-dawn light, meeting in the kitchen for coffee and a quick rundown of the day's tasks. Sometimes the conversation was minimal, a handful of words exchanged between sips of caffeine. Yet that brevity felt natural. Comfort, no more forced politeness or guardedness. They divided the chores effortlessly. While one of them checked the water troughs and tossed out hay, the other might rearrange feed sacks or patch bits of fence that stubbornly refused to stand straight in the cold. Caleb picked up basic veterinary skills, learning how to wrap a horse's leg if it showed signs of strain or cut itself on a stray nail. Riley showed him the proper way to clean and store a saddle, letting him step in to do it more and more often. Evenings carried a similar gentleness. They would share a modest dinner, maybe baked potatoes and a roast of leftover beef. Afterward, they sat on the porch, each with their own thoughts but tethered by the quiet camaraderie that had taken root. Sometimes the only sound between them was the shifting of the old porch boards or the soft rustle of the orchard's last leaves. No one stated out loud what their relationship might be. Friends, confidants, something more. It simply was. The ranch's open land stretched around them, a broad stage where a hush of acceptance hung in the air. In that hush, they discovered something akin to contentment. Whenever they looked out across the rolling fields, they sensed the unspoken truth. They were both exactly where they needed to be. Despite the calm routine, Riley still woke some nights to the phantom thunder of mortar shells, her pulse hammering as if she were back in a desert war zone, although she seldom admitted it out loud. Her sweat-dampened sheets told the story. She might spend an hour sitting on the living room couch afterward, breathing slowly until her heart settled. Caleb, aware of her restlessness, occasionally left a glass of water on the coffee table without comment. He never intruded with well-meant pity. He simply made sure she didn't have to face the trembling alone. Likewise, Caleb had his own midnight battles. Sometimes he'd wander outside, gaze up at the hard sparkle of the Montana stars, and recall the moment he'd chosen not to save the soldier he believed was doomed. The shame, though softened by time, persisted like an old bruise on the soul. Riley would glimpse him through the window, hands shoved deep in his pockets, shoulders tight. She let him be. There are some burdens words cannot fully unravel. One crisp night, after brushing a horse in the barn, Caleb caught Riley stargazing near the paddock fence. He moved beside her, feeling the cold night air burn his lungs. "Do you ever think," he asked softly, "that we're just survivors, people who crawled away from the wreckage?" Her breath puffed out in a visible cloud. "No," she answered, tone firm. "We're not survivors. We're starters. We began something new." Here he mulled it over. The notion that they weren't perpetually defined by what they survived, but by what they might build from it. Resonate. That's a good way to see it. She laid a hand on the fence rail. "We can't cure each other," she said gently, "but we can stand beside one another while the wounds close." He swallowed, nodding at the darkness. Neither spoke further, yet the admission hummed like a comforting note between them. Yes, they were wounded, but they were also forging a path beyond the damage, refusing to let old traumas overshadow whatever lay ahead. Meanwhile, Haven never truly left. It roamed the wide fields and rocky outcrops around Morrigan Ranch, unconstrained by fences or halters. Some days they saw little of the Mustang, perhaps only a distant shape trotting near a cluster of pine. Other days, it reappeared at dawn, calmly inspecting the yard as though verifying that all was